In fact, Jafer just did a thing where he's got to do, he's studying that hum. You know, the hum,
Yeah.
and you know, the hum, the Kundalini hum that you use to rise up. So Jafer's doing a huge, and I said, come on and talk to us about it. So maybe we can get him on.
I'm
But
reading an amazing book right now that all the way back to Parmenides and Plato, they included in poetry those whistling sounds and the rushing sounds that you get in a Kundalini event. And they were talking about this as the central load-bearing pillar of the mysteries way back, like way before Plato. Parmenides, in between Pythagoras and Plato was Parmenides. He wrote a poem that was basically the doors of heaven opening up for you as you're hearing this sound. It was a Kundalini sound. Hey man, have you heard Peter Kingsley? You ever read anything by Peter Kingsley?
Oh, sounds familiar.
Peter Kingsley is amazing. He is the philosopher's philosopher. And I had like a grudge against him because he wouldn't let me interview him because he's just so precious. But I bought his book anyway. And then, wow, it's amazing. And then Chance stole it off me. And now Chance is like, wow. So now we understand why he's the philosopher's philosopher. But go.
He's a academic, and I don't know if this is his specialty, but in this particular book, it's called In the Dark Places of Wisdom. And he talks about this character Parmenides, who was situated in the timeline somewhere between Pythagoras and Plato. So when Plato looked back to his distant past, Pythagoras was obviously a big character, but another huge character was Parmenides, who was a poet. And he was an interesting character because it was generally considered that philosophy should state itself clearly and that poetry wasn't the right mode of expression for philosophy. And why bother making philosophy any harder than it was by putting it in poetic prose? But he wrote this, one of his greatest poems was this poem that was considered bad poetry at the time because in Greek poetry, there was very rigid protocol and you never used the same word twice. And they had all these iambic pentameter rules and stuff. And he broke a lot of those rules. And in particular, he kept using this word over and over and over again, which was absolutely taboo in poetry. But he did it in this way that there's a difference between poetry and incantation, where a really good poet, and so it's kind of the mode I like to work in, where sometimes there's ineffable aspects of philosophy that you can't put into words and you can only express through music or art, or symbolism is obviously the preferred mode of that. But in his writings, he kept using this word over and over again, which was considered bad form in poetry. But this word meant a kind of whistle, like a boiling pot, or the sound a door makes when it opens, kind of more of a high whistling rush. That is apparently the sound that you hear is a very commonly heard sound in a Kundalini event. So this kind of rushing wind, 20 cycle hum in your head that I recently did a podcast about my trip to Valhalla, where I was doing a kind of nadi yoga where I focus on the very highest sound you can hear in your head. And it acted like a helium balloon and it carried me up through these successive stratas of afterlife scenarios. And this sound is an incredibly important thing, but it's almost completely gone from modern conversations of Kundalini. And in this poem, Parmenides wrote that this sound would accompany the opening of the doors of heaven. And anybody who's ever had any Kundalini experiences, you'll know it's an event, it's a threshold event where once it happens, it is sort of like the doors of heaven open to let you in. But it was all predicated on this word, this rushing sound that you hear in your head during these Kundalini moments. So Jafer, what kind of research have you been doing? And is this going to be a book?
I've thought about putting it into a book. For the past 20 years, I've tried to figure out how to experience the various drug-like highs without taking the drugs, and I think I've had a lot of success with that. It's harder to combine them, for example, but one can do it, and it can take months to train yourself to
Years.
follow those pathways. Like, for example, if you define a chakra much in the same way that you do the 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 typical ones that people talk about, we end up having 114 of them. And if you get into certain states, it can help you see some of them. Like if you release a lot of ephedrine or if you have an adrenochrome experience, you're more likely to like see the spots up and down your arms and hands and stuff like this, or otherwise perceive them, rather than just, you know, the bigger ones that people are more familiar with.
I got to meet with Obadiah Harris at the PRS. If anybody knows, Manly P. Hall started a college, basically, the Philosophical Research Society in Los Angeles, and it was taken over by Obadiah Harris after Manly died. And Venice and I moved in like literally
Around the corner.
just like 50 paces away. And one time I was talking to him, and he was telling me the story about, it was a story from the Vedas about this army of 144,000 soldiers. And I was just talking out loud to him about, you know, wondering about some aspect of it. And he says to me, you know, that's all you, right? You know, they're talking about you, and all of these avatars are all talking about you. And it was the first time I learned that there are hundreds of thousands of little chakras. If you know Rosicrucian people, they're quite, Rosicrucians don't observe the classic chakras like in the Hindu mythology, but they're a little more machine code about it, where they actually go to the glands here. Thyroid, right? Thyroid. And in almost every case, there's a gland, or, you know, in this case, there's 3: pineal, pituitary, and thalamus. But in every case, one of your chakras corresponds to some major gland. Interestingly enough, it's also where you have hair on your body. I don't know what that has to do with anything. But yeah, all of those old Vedic stories about the Shiva and the armies, and they all have to do with your world within. And it's marshaling this army of nerve plexus and impulses. And there's a thing that Venice just turned me on to recently that just killed me, that Rudolf Steiner said, your spiritual maturation process is the process of bringing on successively finer bodies. And each one of these bodies that you bring online has its own organs of perception. So if you've ever seen a puppy that was just born, puppies are born without their eyes open, and after a while, their eyes will come online. And they will be able to see. So imagine you have these higher bodies that are coming online. And maybe this is why a Kundalini experience is so pleasurable, is that the birth of this higher entity. But those entities have their own eyes and ears only on your higher body. Your eyes might be seeing in the future. Your ears might be clairvoyance, understanding.
Hearing
like
the angel.
Hearing angels, hearing sounds. That's a good point. And maybe that's what it is. It's the reason you're hearing that sound as a higher body is hearing a sound on another plane or something. But, you know, your electromagnetic body, your lymphatic liquid body, or and then
Emotional body.
Anybody who knows Alex Gray, he did a fantastic painting of these series of higher, subtler bodies. And if you think about the fact that each of these bodies has its own organs of perception, so the things we think of as superpowers or paranormal or para whatever are just natural organs of perception on the higher bodies, which live on, you know, in higher frequencies or higher dimensions. So they might see things that are hidden in the physical dimension. And so that's an amazing part of all of this to me. Well, as well, that you will start hearing and seeing and contacting things that aren't actually there when your higher organs of perception come
But
online.
look, the point is that when you tell about your Kundalini story, Chance, and in your Valhalla to whatever it was, Barcelona to Valhalla, you told the story about how there was a very distinct hum in your head, and you decided to latch onto that hum and follow it up to where it went, right? So we have, you have experienced this, and Japh's been studying it. So I'm kind of, the hum. Yeah. So Japh, what have you found, darling? What's the big reveal on the hum?
Well, I would say it's different in different parts when the sound comes into it. But I would think of it more like a singing or a bell than a hum. But sometimes it's like your perception of other things in a way that, you know, you typically wouldn't. Like I was leading a meditation in my living room once, and there was just some, you know, chirpy little birds outside, and it sounded like some monstrous pterodactyl thing from some dinosaur movie or something.
Wow.
And speaking of hums, there's something that I've heard out here. Have you ever heard of these? I've never heard it except 6 nights in the past 5 years. There's this sound like a Tibetan, one of those Tibetan
bowls.
trumpets.
Okay.
Oh, trumpet.
that
Wow.
but like a constant sound, no difference, like for minutes.
Sid's
And
onto
it's-
it. He said the ringing in the ears, the angelic trumpets. That's exactly what he said.
But yeah, I've heard it 6 times, and it's only with a super volcano earthquake that was felt.
Wow. Wow.
The thing is, it's really weird because there is a Schumann resonance of the planet Earth as well, right? And so the Schumann resonance is like all over the place. And perhaps there's a period where we can hear that. I'm not sure. But look, you were going to say something, John. You're familiar. Go ahead, darling. Yeah.
Couple of things. I have a certain frequency that I hear when I go into meditation, and it's constant, and there's a lot behind that. I also have gotten into there are certain initiatory temples in the world that actually radiate a certain frequency. 512 seems to be the one. It's supposed to bypass the language centers of the brain.
That's the frequency of love, right? My girlfriend does tuning forks, and 512, I think is that the solfeggio of the heart, maybe.
It may be, I'm not sure, because the solfeggios
Is.
definitely have something. I've been looking for, I think I found some decent sources that deal with the chakras. Because if you look for tuning forks and chakras, you're going to get all kinds of different,
I have a good one, darling.
results.
I have a really, really good one I can send you.
Yeah, and I've also been looking to like rifing, where they
Right.
were, yeah,
crazy.
dealing with healing with sound and sound patterns. And some of the books on that seem to have a decent say reference on the chakras and the frequencies. But the 512, since I started using that too, also allows me going deeper, and there's and as we know, there's definitely a lot of resonance in the pyramids. It's the whole thing is a sound machine, and there's something definitely between that and being able to step into either a different plane, or bring them in, with all the stories you've heard, about people staying overnight in the Great Pyramid, and like beings literally walking out of the walls. It scared the living hell out of Napoleon. Supposedly he wouldn't even talk about it. He stayed in there, and he, on his deathbed, he wouldn't even talk about it. He didn't want to be thought of as crazy. But there's something going on there that was most certainly made, for that purpose. And other initiatory, structures do the same thing. They resonate that. But for whatever reason, when I go in, I hear it, and I can't tell. I'm not good enough with pitch to be able to tell what frequency it's at. But I hear the sound, and I go in enough, and it's a constant, background hum. Yeah.
Do you write it, darling? Do you write it? Do you like attach yourself to it? Yeah.
I haven't, because I remember Chance telling me that, the story about how he did that, but he's talking about a very high pitch, and the what I hear isn't exactly high. It's just, but I haven't wrote it. I just hear it, but I really
Yeah,
haven't
but
gone
maybe
into
you're
it.
hearing it at ground floor level, right? Like first of all, somebody just asked, is it a hum? Is it a ring? Is it a bell? What is it? And I would have to say that it's kind of one of those things that is ephemeral, right? It could be many different things.
It's kind of like describing what the color purple looks like
Yeah.
to you, and I don't know if it's the same as the color purple to me. In this poem,
Right.
Parmenides talks about these sounds like the axle turning, a door sliding open, a kettle boiling. In my experience, it was quite a high-pitched hum, but kudos to whoever said that about the angels. The practice of this certain nadi yoga is that you focus on this pitch, and when you first, it's like a million miles away, and it's incredibly high-pitched hum, like a mosquito hum almost for me. And but when you concentrate on it and you spend more time resonating, and you try and bring yourself into resonance with this thing, it'll come closer to you, and then it'll expand from the single band of sound. It'll expand and go sense around, and that's when you start hearing like the angels singing, or a much more beautiful sound that engulfs you. And it's a strange thing. I didn't even know what yoga was until I was past 40. I feel like if I'd started this when I was 9 or 10, I'd be able to be a lot more proactive and in control of it. But even just the dabbling, the superficial dabbling that I've done in it, it is some kind of acoustic auditory feedback process. We talked to Mark Stavich, who talked about photonic events, which is really interesting, because if things are happening in your head, sometimes there's optical light things that might give you the sensation of sound. You're really
Yeah.
hearing a vibration, a cascading ionic vibration that's happening in your head. But yeah, it was a great point that it begins as this really far away hum, but the more time you spend recognizing it and resonating with it, kind of dancing to it or trying to swim in it, or it's hard to put into words, but it will get closer to surround you, and it will become, instead of a mosquito hum, it'll become like a connection of, or like you're in the presence of angels. That's probably the way you attract a host of angels.
9 of Diamonds says the hum is consciousness made manifest, creation, which is a
There is
beautiful way of saying
certainly
that.
something about the Kundalini event and the mushrooms, oddly enough, that you are encountering an intelligence that is not yours. It's the
Yeah.
intelligence of the other. And it may well be the undifferentiated universal consciousness from which everything descends. That we are little individual bubbles that have been separated from the main bubble of consciousness that animates everything.
Yeah,
And
but by the time I got the point, in meditation where the ajna, became permanent sensation, I started hearing pitches, and the only thing I can explain is like a tinnitus that became permanent, and it
Yeah.
changes. And especially when I have epiphanies, the tones will change
Wow.
This is
drastically.
what I'm saying. I think that's why I asked you writing it, darling, right? I think you start here, and as you write it, it goes,
Well, the
I
weird thing
wonder
is that it's
John, I wonder if epiphanies might be like an orgasm on the higher body, because epiphany was what triggered my very first event. It was solving this giant puzzle, and the joy or the endorphin rush. This is very much to do with the serotonin flood too. There's a certain threshold amount of serotonin that we're just never able to get because the food doesn't have nutritional value anymore, and stuff. But so that, sometimes like people on large doses of ecstasy or anything that really causes a serotonin flood, you will see people who didn't expect to have Kundalini experiences that had one because of the flood of serotonin. So there's definitely something that I'm interested in along those lines. And that's why I think if you were a yogi and you were clean your whole life, you would probably have naturally higher levels of serotonin in your body. And I don't think we as Westerners will ever naturally, I hope not. I hope you're right, Jafar, that, and I've certainly had peak experiences, as Robert Anton Wilson used to call them. And I know that the original way to do this is to do it yourself without the aid of technology. And you probably go to real heaven instead of artificial heaven when you do it for real, instead of using synthetic drugs to do it. But interesting phenomena. And we don't really have a cultural context in the West for this thing. And it's happening more and more often. It's like a frying pan full of popcorn seeds, and first one pops and then another one pops, and 3 minutes later another one, and then they start happening faster, and then pretty soon the whole thing pops. And I think our Western culture is going through a collective Kundalini event